Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Matty here, and it's Tuesday, which means it's Tier List Tuesday. It's something that we do hopefully every week on the channel on Tuesdays, where we basically make a tier list and we rank certain things. This week we're going to be ranking the best decks in Pokemon TCG Pocket, an updated meta tier list, ranking the decks based off of what their positions are in the metagame right now. I meant to do a tier list last week on Tuesday, but I just didn't get it out in time. It ended up being released on Wednesday, but on Tuesdays you can expect tier lists on the channel. Now, I think things are really kind of settling down in terms of the Pokemon TCG Pocket Mythical Island metagame. Everything's sort of falling in line, and we're getting a really good idea of sort of what the best decks in the format right now are, how they interact, and sort of, you know, the meta shares, everything. We're getting a much better grasp of how things are kind of settling right now, at least in this format. Things were going to be changing very quickly. The new expansion, the new full expansion to Pokemon Pocket comes out in about 3 weeks now, so we have very little time of this Mythical Island format, but I think for right now, we have most things figured out to at least a fairly significant degree. So let's get right into it, guys. Stick around. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you do, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps out the channel a lot, helps me out a lot, so I really appreciate it. The support has been phenomenal over the last few weeks, so let's try to keep that going. I would really appreciate it. So we're just going to go in order here of the decks that I have here put in. So for simplicity's sake, we were going to try to make this video a little bit shorter. This intro is almost 2 minutes long, yeah, we trimmed the fat a little bit. I think we're down to like 18 or 19 different decks. These are what I consider the most played, the most popular decks in Pokemon TCG Pocket. If something new comes out here in the next few weeks, then you know what? We'll add it to the tier list. But for now, this is sort of the decks that most people are playing. By most, I mean like basically 90% of people. And yeah, let's get right into it. So, Blane. Blane's is the first deck that we're going to be ranking here. So the thing with Blane's is that it's actually sort of on the rise for a lot of reasons. I think that fast-paced decks ended up doing pretty well in this format. I think that Blane has a couple new inclusions, but overall, I think that Blane's is still the same old deck. It has a pretty decent spot, at least in the metagame, but not a great spot. A lot of the top decks in the format, being Mewtwo and Gyarados, definitely do well against Blane. However, it's fast-paced. It's a fairly consistent deck, so you always have that potential because it's got good pacing, because it's got good consistency, and because it has a good Celebi matchup, which, by the way, Celebi is going to be on the rise. I think that Celebi with Exeggutor, if more people especially begin to play Celebi with Exeggutor, I think that Celebi is going to be really potentially an S-tier deck. I mean, it may even make it into S-tier this week, but yeah, so Blane's has a good Celebi matchup. It's got good pacing. You hit for weakness. You can one-hit KO Celebi with something like a Ninetales with Blane, so I actually really do like Blane's in this format. Now, I don't think it's really ever going to be a top-tier deck unless we just get an absolutely like crazy, you know, support for Blane's or an archetype like this. So I'm going to put it in B tier for now. At the end of the video, we'll organize all of these decks and we'll put them in order. But for now, I think that Blane's fits pretty comfortably in the B tier. It was C tier early on, but I've been disrespecting Blane a little bit. I think with the rise of Celebi, it's going to kind of push itself up into B tier. Will it be the highest deck or, you know, at the top of B tier? I don't know. I don't necessarily think so, but we'll see, I guess, as this video goes on. So next up is going to be Charizard EX. So this image is just Charizard. Now, most Charizard decks are running, of course, Moltres, but also Arcanine EX. Some Charizard decks are running Mew. I'm kind of condensing all of those into just one archetype. Really, decks that play Charizard are all kind of doing the same thing, whether you're running, you know, Arcanine or no Arcanine, or Mew or no Mew EX. It's all sort of the same particular strategy. But the thing is with Charizard, and it's actually really funny to see people sort of remember that Charizard was a top tier deck. At the beginning of Genetic Apex, it really wasn't necessarily thought of as a great deck. People were kind of figuring out how to play it. Some people were playing Arcanine with Moltres, some people were playing Charizard. It wasn't really that good, but towards the end of the Genetic Apex format, people really realized that Charizard with Arcanine, just playing an absolute pile of a deck, is actually quite good. It's not necessarily consistent, but it's extremely powerful, and the upside is really high. We talked a little bit about this sort of difference between consistency and power in terms of a deck's viability in my previous meta report video that I posted yesterday, so if you haven't watched that, definitely go check it out. But, you know, the thing with Charizard is, no, it's not necessarily the most consistent deck in the game. It does require a lot of moving pieces to get set up properly. Of course, you need Moltres in the active spot. You need to flip heads with that, you know, Moltres attack that accelerates energies, and we need to evolve into our Charizard relatively quickly. But if all of those things happen, there's really nothing in the game that can take down Charizard. It does 200 damage. And with the potential to have 6 or 7 energies on turn 3, it makes this deck an absolute high roller deck. But you know what? If we're talking about a deck's viability, consistency isn't necessarily the one thing that we're talking about here. Overall strength is certainly something to discuss as well. And Charizard's it's got strength in spades, honestly. So I'm going to put Charizard in the A tier, and it's probably going to be looking like a high A tier in my opinion, but okay, so next go to the next deck here on the tier list. We're going to take a look at Articuno. Now again, similar to Charizard, there's a lot of different ways to play Articuno. You could play it with Greninja, you can play it with Starmie. I've actually seen a lot of people playing it with that Druddigon Greninja package, which I think is really interesting for sure, but it's kind of sneaking in to do some decent placements in the tournaments. I think it's fallen off in play. Now, I do actually think Articuno has a pretty good place right now in the current metagame. It's interesting. I think that tempo decks in general are fairly strong at the moment. I think that the Greninja Druddigon package is kind of cool to play with Articuno as well, but it's tough for me to like put it in the A tier. Like I don't necessarily feel very strongly about Articuno, and we haven't seen enough people play it. It did recently make top cut at the 2,000 player tournament. It was the only sort of non-top tier deck that made top cut. There was one Articuno and one Aerodactyl fighting deck, so that to me shows that like even though limited people are playing Articuno, it still has that potential. It's still, of course, you still have Misties, you can pop off, you can go crazy. And I think, honestly, with Druddigon being in the active spot, it can do a little bit of chip damage. Gives us some more time to set up our Articuno and then have an Articuno with full HP and Greninja to try to do some really significant chip damage. So I think it's interesting. But I haven't... Yeah, I can't put it in the A tier, at least at the moment. We're going to put in B tier. Again, not organized yet. We'll organize it later. I'm going to put Articuno in the B tier, but honestly, it could deserve sort of a low A tier spot, I think, in terms of its position in the metagame, but not enough people are playing it, so it's hard for me to kind of say that. I do think that Pikachu decks that are strong against Articuno are going to be on the decline. We'll talk about that in a little bit when we get to Pikachu, but yeah, overall, I don't think that Articuno is a bad deck. I think that people haven't necessarily spent too much time, figuring out the best way to play Articuno right now, because I think they would rather play other decks. Articuno gets a bad rep in general. It's a deck that not a lot of people like, but it is still a good deck. It's a quality list. So we're gonna put it in B tier for now, but I don't know. It's fringe. It's fringe A, low B, or low A, B tier. Okay, next up is Pidgeot EX. So Pidgeot is also one of these weird decks, again, where we can play it so many different ways. A lot of these sort of B-tier fringe decks, there's not really an agreed upon way of how to play them. It makes them really interesting because they're pretty flexible, especially a card like Pidgeot, because it's a colorless Pokemon. You can play it in a lot of different ways. There's a really cool Psychic type Pidgeot list. There's the Druddigon Greninja with Weezing, or with Pidgeot. There's the Weezing way to play Pidgeot. So there's a lot of different ways. In fact, there's actually sort of a fighting toolbox version of Pidgeot as well that kind of uses it as sort of that backup attacker. We're still running, the Hitmonlee, Marshadows, things like that, but you can run Pidgeot in the deck as well. So it's interesting. It's not a bad card inherently. I've said this a lot of times. It's just hard to compare it to some of the other cards in the format that just have more upside, specifically all of these Stage 2 EX Pokemon, things like Charizard, like a... Charizard, yeah, I mean, Charizard's kind of the really only Stage 2 Pokemon that sees play, but things like a Gyarados, which I know isn't a Stage 2 Pokemon, but very comparable in Pidgeot, it's just a little bit better. Even Mewtwo, to some extent, as a basic Pokemon, is better. So Pidgeot is tough. There's just other decks that do things that it does, but they do it kind of better and more consistently. Being a Stage 2 Pokemon is pretty tough in the current metagame. You have to be something like a Charizard. Doing 140 damage sometimes with Pidgeot just doesn't really cut it, even though we do have 170 HP. It's just kind of not up there. I'm going to put it in the B tier. Now, again, we could see, because Pidgeot decks are really flexible, we could see a really good anti-meta way to play Pidgeot, and again, it's flexible, so I don't think it's terrible, but in general, I think it's going to be a B tier deck. I don't see it really in the A tier, and not enough people play it for it to really have a lot of tournament results, but Pidgeot is still a significant archetype, and I think that there's merit to Pidgeot, so I wanted to keep including it here on the tier list, but right now I just don't really see it being really any more prominent than anything else here in the B tier, so it might actually fall into the C tier. I'm not going to be honest. You know what? I'm actually going to put it in the C tier. This is kind of disrespectful to Pidgeot, but I don't know. It just hasn't done anything in the format. I guess I could look and check, but to be honest with you, is it better than Blane? Is it better than Articuno? Maybe. I'll keep it in the B tier for now. It might get kicked out later. We'll see. So next up, we're gonna have Aerodactyl and Farfetch'd. So this is sort of one of the two most popular ways to play sort of that aggro fighting type deck. The other version is going to be with Primeape. That's kind of the big difference. Now, both of these decks are very similar. They both have Aerodactyl. They both have the Hitmonlee and Marshadow package, which is really strong. They go together really well. It's good against Gyarados, and it's good against a lot of decks, particularly Pikachu decks, to do pretty good damage. Now, instead of playing Primeape, which is a stage 1 Pokemon that does 50 damage, we play Farfetch'd, which is a basic Pokemon, does 40 damage, it has less HP, but basically Farfetch'd is really good if you're going second. It's 40 damage right off the bat for only 1 energy. On your first turn going second, it can be extremely strong, whereas Primeape, it's a little bit stronger, has a little bit more HP, and it's really good going second, but in general, it's just perhaps a little bit less consistent of a card. But there's multiple different ways, basically, to play this aggro, fast-paced fighting type archetype. This is just one of them. Now, to be honest with you, it's the least common way to play fighting now, or not the least common, but the lesser of the two. Primeape, the Primeape version of the deck is certainly more popular, which kind of skews my opinion on these decks. I don't really think that fighting type right now, I did put it in the S tier previously because I thought it was a really strong anti-meta pick, but right now I don't really see these fighting type decks kind of finding a great way into the S tier right now. But I do think that both the Primeape list and the Farfetch'd Aerodactyl lists are most likely A tier decks. I still think they have a good position in the metagame right now. Pikachu, while struggling against all of the Celebes, which are on the rise, as well as Mewtwo, we oftentimes see that these fighting decks have a good Gyarados matchup as well as a good Pikachu matchup, and both of those decks are pretty common in the format right now, so I do feel comfortable playing Aerodactyl and Farfetch'd in the A tier. It's really the one true, fast, aggressive deck right now, though the fastest, most aggressive deck in the game, with Farfetch'd, with Hitmonlee, with Marshadow. I think it's just really, really strong. So we're going to put it in the A tier for now, and I think Primeape might find its way in the A tier as well, but definitely not kind of reaching into the S tier, at least at the moment. Okay, so next up we've got Arcanine, and this one is actually really interesting. I want to spend some time talking about Arcanine because, fire decks I think are certainly on the rise. At the recent 2,000 player Ursa Days tournament that wrapped up this past weekend, we saw 2 Charizard and Arcanine decks make it into the top cut bracket. One Charizard deck even got second place, placing just behind and losing to Gyarados in the finals of a 2,000 player tournament. And Charizard wasn't necessarily a maximum or a heavily played deck. It was sort of like I think it was like the 10th or 9th most played deck in the tournament. So it was quite a surprise, but we spent a lot of time, like I said in our meta report video, talking about Charizard and why it is certainly still a strong pick, especially for online tournaments. Now, the thing with Arcanine, and what Arcanine is here, and you can see the deck list example here on the bottom right, it's different than Charizard. So I have Charizard on here separately, even though Arcanine is often played in the Charizard EX decks. The Arcanine decks are different. They're kind of a tempo fire deck where you're playing Arcanine, you're playing Moltres, and then you're playing like Mew EX to help you in some of those sort of mid-range deck matchups like Mewtwo, like Charizard, in matches sort of like that. Now, Arcanine has a great Celebi matchup. It has a good matchup into Pikachu as well, so it's kind of a tempo deck that beats other tempo decks, and since it is a tempo deck, meaning it's sort of in between, a setup long-turn deck and an aggro deck, it does well against the aggro fighting decks as well because we just sort of one-shot everything in their deck, basically. So it's quite strong, and then we also have Mew EX for those other matchups. So I really like Arcanine. In fact, if you go back a week or two, I thought Arcanine would be the best fire-type deck, and I thought that it was actually really, really good, and it's been doing pretty good. But in general, it doesn't have the same upside, right? As being a tempo deck, it doesn't have the same upside as Charizard does as sort of a late game setup deck, doing incredible damage with Charizard, which just basically auto-wins some matchups. However, we are running Mew EX, which is going to be good against Charizard and against Mewtwo, so it's interesting to me. I honestly thought Arcanine would rise potentially to be close to a high A tier, S tier deck. I still think it's really good, but it just hasn't necessarily risen in popularity. Again, it's floating around that 8th, 9th, 10th most played deck spot, and it's probably going to fall behind Charizard due to those recent successful placements of Charizard, but I still feel really confident in Arcanine. I think that it's very consistent. It's kind of the closest thing to Pikachu that fire-type decks have, but again, 120 damage is 120 damage, and there are a lot of decks that are just out of range of you, which is why hopefully that Mew EX helps, but a lot of times it just doesn't necessarily, I guess, flow super confidently. You do have a tough Gyarados matchup. I should probably mention that your Gyarados matchup is not particularly great. Probably a big reason why Arcanine hasn't necessarily done super well in the top cuts of these brackets, whereas Charizard has a much better opportunity against Gyarados, again, because we can one-hit KO those enemy Gyaradoses. But yeah, I'm going to keep Arcanine in the A tier. I think it's really consistent, similar to Pikachu decks that oftentimes fall into A tier. I do think that Arcanine is still a strong deck. It's just not particularly that popular. So next up, we're going to have the Exeggutor EX deck playing Celebi and Mew EX. This is really, in my opinion, the second best way to play Celebi. Now, we did include Celebi and Serperior, just sort of straight Jungle Totem Celebi in this list, which we'll talk about next. It's next up here on the list, but I don't really even consider that like a proper way to play Celebi, even though it is the most played version of Celebi EX. I think a big reason for that is people don't necessarily have Celebi and Exeggutor. They maybe just have the Jungle Totem Serperior. So if you don't have Exeggutor, it's tough to really play the best version of Celebi, but I actually really like this Exeggutor deck. This is another deck that I want to spend some time talking about because I think the big reason why Celebi is so strong in the format right now isn't necessarily because of the Celebi card itself. I think that Exeggutor, in fact, is actually just one of the best decks to play in the format right now. It has a really strong matchup against these aggro fighting type decks. You have so much HP, and we play Erica, so we can kind of stay alive for very long. We could potentially hit for 80 damage over and over again, which again is actually really phenomenal. It's kind of faster paced and a little bit tankier than most tempo decks. So even against things like Celebi or Pikachu or even Arcanine, we actually have a pretty strong advantage in those decks. Basically, we just have to get a little bit lucky and flip heads on tails. The strategy with this deck is that we lead off with Exeggutor, we attach an energy to it, we attack turn after turn after turn. We try to take a KO or two with Exeggutor in our active spot, we heal it up for as long as we can, keep it alive for as long as we can with Ericas, and then once our Exeggutor goes down, hopefully we have 4 or 5 energies on our Celebi EX, or 3 energies at least on our Mew EX to potentially finish up the game and take a KO on whatever our opponent brings in that eventually does KO our Exeggutor. So the line and the sort of the flow of the deck makes a lot of sense. And again, Exeggutor is really strong in this format. So I really, really like this deck. I think the funny thing about this deck in particular is that it struggles. Its worst matchup, honestly, is against things like other Celebi decks that are playing Jungle Totem Serperior. So it's really weird. Like this version of Exeggutor and Celebi and Mew EX is better in basically almost every other matchup because it's so much more consistent than the Jungle Totem Serperior version of Celebi. However, when they match up against each other, it struggles because in the very late game, Celebi basically, because the other Celebi decks have Erica as well, right? So like, it's not like your pace is significantly an advantage in that matchup. A lot of times those Celebi and Exeggutor decks are also playing Exeggutor, you know, like, so it's the most common way to play Celebi, or I guess the best way to play Celebi that we've seen in the rankings is Celebi with Exeggutor and Serperior. I'm kind of getting a little confused even right now because there's so many Celebi decks. But yeah, Exeggutor with Mew EX and Celebi, because we're not playing Jungle Totem, isn't as strong in the late game, which means that Celebi can kind of take a lot of time and, you know, set up with Jungle Totem and kind of sweep you. So that's kind of the one scenario where this deck is worse than running Serperior with Jungle Totem. But in every other matchup, it's a little bit more consistent, which makes this deck really interesting. It hasn't necessarily caught on in terms of, you know, people commonly playing it. It's definitely the third most popular way to play Celebi and Exeggutor, so for that reason, it's definitely not going to find its way into S tier. It just hasn't seen enough play, but I actually really love this way to play Celebi and Exeggutor with Mew EX. I think it's phenomenal. So we're going to throw it in the A tier for now, but yeah, just absolutely crazy. So okay, here's where things get certainly a little bit controversial. Now, the most common, the most popular way of playing Celebi right now isn't with an Exeggutor focus necessarily. The way that it's sort of categorized on the online tournament platform and Limitless is that it's Celebi and Serperior or Celebi and Exeggutor, right? They're kind of different. So a lot of decks that aren't playing any Exeggutor in it, or they're only playing maybe one copy of Exeggutor, are categorized under a different version of Celebi. And that version of Celebi that we're taking a look at here is by far the worst performing version of Celebi. So it's very apparent to us that you want to play Exeggutor and have a strong focus with Exeggutor in your Celebi deck. So that's why I honestly, like, I didn't even want to include this Celebi deck in the tier list because it really is like the worst way to play Celebi. And there's 2 other ways to play it that are better. It's just that a lot of people aren't necessarily focused on Serperior yet. For example, in the Ursa Days 2,000 player tournament, this version of Celebi had a 41% win rate, whereas Exeggutor and Celebi had a 56% win rate. So that's basically a 15% difference in win rate between these 2 decks, and they're virtually the same. One's just focused around Exeggutor more so, or one is not. So that's why this deck, honestly, like, I wouldn't even include it in the tier list, but the thing is, a lot of people are still playing Celebi this way, just because maybe they're not watching my videos. I don't know how to tell you, but because it's still the most popular way to play Celebi, even though it's not nearly as good, we kind of have to include it in the tier list. But yeah, I'm going to put this in the B tier. It's still Celebi, so it's not a terrible deck. but it's honestly not nearly as good as the other ways to play Celebi. Hopefully in the coming weeks, this deck version of Celebi just doesn't exist and people are just consistently playing it with Exeggutor, but we'll have to see. This version right here with Exeggutor, we'll talk about for sure. That is sort of the one that everybody has in their minds, but for this one, yeah, it's going in the B tier. It's just not the right way to play Celebi. Okay, anyway. Sorry for that tangent. That was absolutely ridiculous. Okay, so next up we have sort of the next Aerodactyl version, which is going to be a very similar version to the Farfetch'd deck that we took at earlier, but now we're kind of incorporating Mew EX. I really do think these archetypes, again, should be kind of categorized as one, but they are technically separate because one incorporates Mew EX and one doesn't. One has sort of a reliance on Mew EX, and I actually do like it. Again, there's so many different ways to play these Aerodactyl aggro fighting decks. It's tough to, like, get a mark on it. Like, the most popular one is Primeape, and I think that Primeape has the most results by far. But if we go down, I'm just here looking at the metagame list. So, like, literally, this Aerodactyl and Mew EX deck only had 15 players playing it out of 2,000, whereas the Aerodactyl and Farfetch'd deck had 30, and then the Primeape deck had 80. But the problem is that Primeape isn't necessarily the best way to play Aerodactyl. It's just a lot of people have sort of understood, or I guess kind of fallen in line with sort of what the most popular way to play the deck is. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad deck. It just means that it's not necessarily caught on in terms of its popularity. But I'm going to put it right up here. I'm going to put it next to the other Farfetch'd deck. I wanted to include it because they are kind of two different flavors of the same archetype, but they both definitely are still good anti-meta picks, and they do have sort of a stronger matchup. Whether you want to focus more on being sort of just a fast-paced, aggressive playstyle, or sort of have an additional backup option in the mid to late game with Mew EX for some of those matchups, it's really up to you however you kind of want to play the deck. It kind of has different strengths depending on, the cards that you're playing in the matchups that you go up against. They're very similar. Again, it's very sort of a niche, small difference. So next up we have Golem, and now Golem is still a played deck. If I'm being honest with you, it's I think a top 10 or 11 or 12 most played deck in the format right now. With Druddigon, it's still kind of a common way that people are playing it. Machamp never really caught on. Golem did pop off and win in Ursa Day's tournament, mainly because it's not a bad deck, and I think that at the time, a lot of people weren't necessarily prepared for the fighting decks. Pikachu was exceedingly popular, and it just honestly kind of rolled through it. Now, I don't think that Golem's a bad deck, but again, it's really fallen off in terms of its play, based off of most people kind of playing more of those aggressive, fast-paced fighting decks like Primeape, which we'll see after this. So Golem has fallen off. I don't think it ever really had a great position in the metagame. I did think that before we even knew sort of about the aggro fighting decks, or since they became popular, it did look like Golem was going to be like kind of the best anti-meta pick, but I think for right now, it's sort of fallen off, and it just really isn't the best option. I think people are a little bit more prepared for it. I think that people are kind of changing their deck lists to account for things like this a little bit more so, and there's just other faster paced decks that have a better matchup, and Celebi again on the rise, which has a really pretty good matchup against Golem as well. So yeah, we're gonna put Golem in the S tier. I don't think it's something that's worth playing really to any degree anymore. Again, it's going down every week in play, so it kind of makes sense, but overall I would say that Golem isn't really anything I would play, especially in terms of these fighting decks. I just don't necessarily think that Golem is probably our best option here. Okay, so next up is going to be the most common way to play these fighting aggressive decks, which is Aerodactyl and Primeape. So again, we talked about it a little bit. It's sort of a deck that has strengths going first with Primeape. If it's your second turn going first, you can start attacking with Primeape for 50 damage, only 1 energy. It's really, really strong decks like this, similar to Exeggutor and Weezing decks as well, have that advantage when they go first, being a stage 1 Pokemon with only 1 energy in its attack cost. It's a big upside. It's a particular kind of archetype of cards in Pokemon Pocket that, since most decks want to go second because you're ahead on energies, don't like to go first. So when you're playing a deck that actually does do pretty well to be be going first in the game, it brings quite a few upsides to it, and Primeape certainly has that advantage. But there's also good cards going second with things like Hitmonlee, which is a basic Pokemon as well in the deck, and then our backup option to Marshadow. We also have Aerodactyl for the mid to late game. So I do like this this fighting type deck. It's by far the most played version of these Aerodactyl lists, and because of that, it's seen definitely the most results. Now, I do think that these aggro decks are falling out of favor a little bit, again, because the rise of Exeggutor in the format, and Exeggutor is just so good. Mewtwo as well, kind of being the most popular deck in the game right now, makes these archetypes feel not so good, these fighting type archetypes personally, which is why I don't want to, I'm not going to put it in S tier this week. It's funny, we haven't even talked about any S tier decks yet. But yeah, I had this S tier last week because I did think it was going to be kind of the best anti-meta contender. I put this and Pikachu and Zebstrika in the S tier because they were kind of really good counters to the metagame and the top of the metagame. But I think right now, because of the rise of Celebi and Exeggutor, which is kind of the gatekeeper for a lot of these anti-meta decks, like the aggressive fighting decks and Pikachu Zebstrika, because of the rise of Celebi, I don't want to put this in the S tier anymore. I do think that it's a pretty comfortable A tier pick. Again, we'll rearrange these and put these in order at the end of the video, but for now, I think that most of these Aerodactyl aggro fighting decks are really good. I think aggro decks are still pretty good, but with the rise of Exeggutor, they're going to be kind of on the decline. For that reason, we're going to put it in the A tier for now. Next up is going to be Mew EX with Farfetch'd, I believe. This is different, I think. Yeah, I think this is different than the Greninja with Mew EX and Tauros deck. So this is going to be basically Mew EX kind of wrapped into that fast-paced aggro fighting type package, but a little bit different, meaning like we're not playing the Aerodactyl, we're kind of just focused around those aggro cards and then playing something like a Mew EX. We may even run Tauros in the deck kind of as our mid to late game finishing attacking options, as opposed to something like an Aerodactyl EX. So you lose a little bit of that disruption with Aerodactyl, but Mew EX being a little bit more of a powerful attacker, it's also a basic Pokemon, gives the deck a little bit more consistency in its flow, less evolution Pokemon, more room for trainers and supporters and things like that. So I do think that this is a totally fine list. I don't think we've really seen particularly that much results from it. I think that since a lot of people are kind of choosing not to play Mew EX in aggro decks as often, it's hard for me to put it in the A tier anymore. I think we put this in the A tier last week, but I'm going to kind of put it just in the B tier. I don't really have a lot to say about it. I think it's a fine deck. I think they're versatile. It's just trying to do a lot of things at once, and I think decks that aren't necessarily really easy to comprehend what the strategy is when they don't necessarily have like a really plain sort of you know, how they work isn't necessarily very clear for a lot of people. You do have the advantage as the opponent if your opponent doesn't necessarily know what your deck is or what it does. But for the most part, I think most people are choosing not to play these decks because they're not necessarily super straightforward, even if they have a really balanced matchup spread. So for now, we're going to put it in the B tier. I think, again, it's kind of a niche pick. It's probably better than the other decks that we put in the B tier, to be honest with you, but we can't have everything in the A tier. So next up, we have Celebi and Exeggutor. So this is really interesting to me. This is one that I kind of wanted to spend the most time on. So again, Exeggutor really, really good in the format right now. I think that these Celebi decks that are playing Exeggutor, it kind of makes the deck a lot more front-loaded while also having a really good back-loaded option in Celebi. Now, this deck here that we've talked about is different than the Exeggutor and Mew EX because instead of playing Mew EX, we're playing the Serperior package. Less room for trainers and supporter cards, but technically speaking, it's very similar to Charizard in the sense that we have, you know, basic Pokemon, Stage 1 Pokemon, Stage 2 Pokemon, basically just an absolute pile of cards that if they all get drawn in the proper sequence, we can beat almost any deck in the format. So it's similar to Charizard. I think that it has a little bit more consistency in the early to mid game, having Exeggutor and Celebi as basic Pokemon being our attacking options, whereas our backup sort of setup option being our Stage 2 Pokemon in the Serperior. It's a little bit different than Charizard. So our backloaded sort of upside towards the mid to late game is necessarily not as high, but our potential and consistency and pace in the early to mid game is a lot better with Celebi. But I really, really like it. I think that it's kind of gatekeeping the format right now in a really weird way, where a lot of those strong anti-meta picks like the aggressive Aerodactyl fighting decks and Pikachu are really kind of walled by Exeggutor and Celebi. You know what I mean? It's sort of this deck that is kind of rising to counter the anti-meta decks. It's sort of the counter to the counter. However, it can't kind of hang with the other top decks in the format, that of course being Gyarados and Mewtwo. Spoiler alert. So here's kind of a hot take, or maybe not a hot take. I think a lot of people probably agree with this to some degree. In the last couple tier lists, people were like, Celebi's not S tier, but it really wasn't. There had no reason to put Celebi in the S tier up until now. And it does kind of make a lot of sense. I think that Exeggutor has made Celebi really good. I think that Pikachu and the aggro fighting decks are common enough now to where I feel a little bit more confident in placing Celebi EX in the S tier. This is the first time that I've done that, actually, and I don't regret it. I think that right now is by far the best time to play Celebi and Exeggutor in this particular format. Now, it hasn't really won many tournaments yet. I think last tournament it got absolutely dominated in the final bracket by things like Charizard, by Gyarados, by Mewtwo. But that doesn't necessarily mean it isn't an S tier deck. So it's going in the S tier for now. Now that might change. Again, Charizard might be on the rise due to its performance of last week's tournament, but I still think that Celebi overall is such a really strong deck. Similarly, again, to things like Charizard, but it's weird. It's sort of a mash between everything. It's got some Pikachu elements, it's got some Mewtwo elements, it's got some Charizard elements. It's really, really interesting, but I think really just the fact that you have Exeggutor EX with Erica's makes this deck so good, potentially, in the early game, which I think gives it a lot of strength. So going in the S tier, and I don't regret it. Next up is Gyarados. We all know, I don't really even need to say anything about Gyarados. It's won this last 2,000 player tournament. It's basically gotten either first, second, third, or fourth in every tournament since it's became popular in the metagame. It's got everything going for it. Yes, it has hard counters and things like the aggro fighting decks and Zebstrika, but again, if you draw really well, like Gyarados literally has, it's got sort of a same feel to it as Articuno did back then in the last format, where you can literally have a fully set up Gyarados on turn 2, and it's like, what, you know, like, what are we doing? Like, the game's over. Like, what am I supposed to do about that? Most decks just don't have a counter to it. It's a really, really strong, you know, like late game setup sweeper deck, but it has like this really interesting potential to be faster paced than it should be because of Misty's and because it's only a stage 1 Pokemon. It's sort of a potential extremely strong tempo deck, which makes it just that much stronger in the format right now. 180 HP is crazy. There's literally like nothing in the game that can even counter that other than Charizard. So it's really crazy. Maybe even a Celebi, you need 4 coin flips though, and that's honestly not that easy to do, especially on turn 2 or turn 3, which you might be facing down a Gyarados. So I've talked about it so much. Gyarados is just the overall, I think, the strongest deck in the format, but I think it does have some specific hard counters, like I said, with Hitmonlee being able to snipe the Magikarps on the bench. Same with Zebstrika and Pikachu in general, you know, hitting for weakness against this deck. I think that even with its hard counters right now in the format, which again, against Pikachu and the fighting decks, we have like a 30 or 40% win rate, which is quite bad, but it still just doesn't matter because we're so strong, we're so dominant. So Gyarados staying in the S tier. It's been S tier for a while. It will probably remain that way unless something crazy happens, honestly. But yeah, Gyarados S tier for sure. Now on to Mewtwo EX, which, spoiler, we all kind of know it. It's going to be S tier as well. Can I even, well, whatever. It's going to go S tier as well. We all knew that Mewtwo would be probably, at least I did. I thought Mewtwo would be the best card, or the best deck rather, in the format. Once I saw Mew EX, I was like, oh man, like Mewtwo can just kind of wipe Charizard off the face of the earth now. But then I saw Mythical Slab, and I was like, okay, so now it's just faster paced now. Like now it's just more consistent. Like, really, that's what we needed to do, was give Mewtwo like better draw. Like that's what we're doing. Surprising to say the least. But when I saw those cards come out, I knew it would be a top tier deck, and it really hasn't surprised me. Things like Gyarados did surprise me originally, but Mewtwo, it just didn't surprise me. I knew it would be a top tier deck. It did win the recent 2,000 player tournament, so when I organize all of these cards, it might find its way to the #1 spot. We'll have to see, but I think right now, Celebi is sneaking into S tier. It's definitely bottom of S tier, and Mewtwo and Gyarados are really, like, they're just at the top. They're just dominating. They're the 2 best decks. They have good pace. They have extremely strong mid to late games. They're resilient. They're stage 1 in basic Pokemon that do crazy amounts of HP, 140, 150. They just got everything going for them. They have a lot of support, and it's hard to not kind of put those in the S tier. So that's where they're going. They're going in the S tier, and I don't you know, I don't regret it. I stand by it. Okay, so now on to some, spoiler, not S tier decks. We have Scolipede. Scolipede, man. I say it every week. This deck, Scolipede and Weezing, was really sort of the destined counter pick to Mewtwo EX. It just didn't have a strong enough matchup spread against all of these other decks that we see in the A and the B tier, and that's sort of the big problem with Scolipede. It has a great Mewtwo matchup, but unfortunately it has a bad matchup against all the other decks that you're probably going to play against. Now, if the, you know, aggro fighting decks didn't become exceedingly popular in the format, maybe Scolipede would have had a chance to kind of be in that sort of B to low A tier range. I don't think it's a bad deck. It's just there's so much fighting type cards going around. There's so much Celebi, Charizard going around, and even Gyarados as well, that there isn't just a lot of room. You can't play like a specific, you know, anti-meta Mewtwo deck when it just struggles against other cards in the format. So that's why I'm putting Scolipede in the C tier with Golem. Weezing is good, but Scolipede in general, the deck isn't fast-paced enough. We don't have enough great basic dark type Pokemon to really kind of front load this deck, which makes it a little bit awkward. And in general, I wish it was better. It might even be just like a B tier deck, but in general, I think its placement in the meta is probably in the C tier, unfortunately. Now, again, I say that, but we might even just see like Scolipede win. Now, here's the thing, like, even these C tier decks, I'm putting them in C tier and these decks in the B tier, but they could literally just win a tournament. at any point in time. I do like Scolipede. Like, I do want to put it in the B tier because it's stronger than, like, it's inherently stronger than Blane's and probably Pidgeot. It's just that it has a really bad spot in the matchup in the meta right now. But, you know, Mewtwo did just win that previous tournament. So if we're going to be kind of perspective, you know, talking about maybe the best decks to play right now, maybe Scolipede does kind of go into that B tier because it does have a strong Mewtwo matchup and more people are going to be playing Mewtwo now than ever before. So, you know, maybe it does go into B tier. Do we want to put it bottom B tier, Scolipede? I don't know. Some people really love it, to be honest with you. But no, I'm gonna keep it in the C tier. I don't think it's a great time right now to play Scolipede, but maybe it will be. Scolipede for president. Let's see. Maybe it's gonna win. Maybe it'll just win next week's or today's tournament. We'll see. Probably not. Okay, so Pikachu and Raichu. Here we go. So Pikachu and Raichu. I'm not gonna talk too much about it. It's going in the B tier. I kind of feel bad about this deck because I did kind of predict it to be like an S tier pick. I thought with the rise of Gyarados that Pikachu and Raichu would have sort of the best flexible matchups, not only being strong against Gyarados, but against other decks in the format. Unfortunately, it just didn't necessarily pan out that way. I think that it's still a good option, but the amount of people playing Pikachu and Raichu is just extraordinarily low compared to Pikachu and Zebstrika. Several reasons for that. Some of you guys pointed out in the comments that yes, it is a little bit harder. It's more complex to play, which is probably why a lot of people shied away from it. But I don't know. It just didn't necessarily seem to have as good of a matchup spread in the format as I thought it would. Also, all of the aggro fighting decks became exceedingly popular, which made playing this version of Pikachu much worse since it isn't really a fast-paced version of Pikachu. It's more of a setup version of Pikachu, which again struggles really heavily against those fast-paced fighting decks. So Pikachu and Raichu, before the Aerodactyl aggro decks kind of took over, I thought this would be a potential S tier deck, but it ended up being Pikachu and Zebstrika being S tier for a moment. However, we'll see that I don't believe it's still S tier. So I'm going to put it in the B tier right now. No, I don't think that it's a great time to play Pikachu and Raichu. A lot of fighting decks going around, a lot of Mewtwo, a lot of Celebi with Exeggutor, which makes this deck just a little bit tougher than it probably should be to play. And then next up, we're going to have Mew EX with, I believe this is going to be with like Greninja and is it with Druddigon? I don't know. The list will be down below. This might be the Hooglin deck. I'm not, I kind of, or maybe it's Bullfrog. Maybe it's probably the Bullfrog archetype, isn't it? But I think it's Greninja with Tauros, Mew EX, probably some other cards as well. Now, I do like this deck. It's actually really, really interesting. So Mew EX with Greninja, the Bullfrog archetype, as we'll call it, always has a really good win rate, but it doesn't have a high amount of people playing the deck. Again, the reason for that is it's not like super obvious like what this deck does to a lot of people, especially new players. They're not going to choose to play this over something like Gyarados or Celebi or Mewtwo, which just makes it like kind of out of favor in terms of the top most played decks. But as far as decks that are kind of outside that top 10 most played decks range, it honestly like does better on average. It has a really great matchup spread across the board. So I do like this deck. Honestly, it's going to be tough to see it kind of win tournaments because not enough people are playing the deck for it to sort of win tournaments. But it certainly has the potential to. So I'm going to put it in the A tier, not the top of A tier, but maybe we'll see. These aren't organized yet per se. So we'll kind of see once we organize the list. But yeah, for now, I do want to put it in A tier. I think it has a really balanced matchup spread. It doesn't necessarily like auto-win certain things, but it is just really balanced and really good in a lot of different scenarios. And then lastly, we have Pikachu with Zebstrika. So the thing with Pikachu and Zebstrika, last week I had it, I think, in the S tier because I thought it was probably the best anti-meta pick in a format that was seemingly being dominated by Gyarados EX. However, you know, fighting type decks are on sort of the decline slightly. They're still really popular, but I think with Exeggutor and Celebi kind of going crazy, this deck honestly gets walled kind of slightly by it. Now, it is a really good pace, but, you know, Exeggutor has really good pace also. So, like, what is your Zebstrika really going to do in the face of 160 HP, you know, Exeggutor that is healing for 50 damage every other turn with Erica's and doing 80 damage potentially with its one energy attack? It's tough, right? So this is sort of the aggro, the faster paced way to play Pikachu. Still a very, very good deck. I do think it belongs in the A tier. I think very similarly to these aggro fighting decks, it's really strong. Pikachu is very consistent, and this gives it a little bit more front-loaded power and options. It's really strong against Gyarados. Still, however, like I said, it's going to be struggling a little more against those fighting decks, against Exeggutor, which is going to be on the rise, as well as Mewtwo. It doesn't have a great Mewtwo matchup either. So, again, it's kind of an anti-meta pick. Because of that, I don't think really any of these anti-meta decks really belong in the S tier with sort of the big three right now, and that's my opinion. So you can quote me on that. Things might change, but for right now, this is my S tier, and I think it'll probably stay this way. I think that the format isn't necessarily going to change a lot in the next, week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks until we see the new expansion. I think things are, primarily sort of settled down and kind of figured out for the most part. We'll see. I could be wrong about that, but I don't think I'll make a tier list next week or maybe even the week after that on sort of the current metagame and the best decks. I'll probably find something else to make tier lists on because I think for right now, this is kind of what we're going to see. So here's what we're going to do. This is all of the decks in the right tiers. I've placed them in their tiers, but now what we're going to do is we're going to organize all of these decks within their tiers, and we're going to give like a definitive actual sort of ranking, like one by one. All right, and here we go. This is the organized tier list right now of the best decks to play in Pokemon TCG Pocket. Let's run through it right now in order. I do have Mewtwo EX as the best deck in Pokemon TCG Pocket to play. I don't think it's inherently as strong as Gyarados, but it doesn't have enough people trying to counterplay it. There are sort of a lot of decks playing Mew EX, but compared to the people playing things like Pikachu and Zebstrika or the Aerodactyl aggro decks with Hitmonlee, there just isn't a lot of people countering Mewtwo, which I think is why it's really dominating the meta right now. So I think it not only is it extremely consistent, but it has a pretty good spot in the meta right now. I think it's just honestly the #1 deck currently. Not only that, but it did win the recent tournament as well. No, it didn't actually. It won 2 weeks ago. Gyarados won this week, but either way, I do think that Mewtwo is still the #1 pick right now in this format. Next up is Gyarados. Basically the same as Mewtwo. I feel more comfortable saying Mewtwo as the best deck because Gyarados does have specific decks that can do really well against it. Of course, Pikachu with Zebstrika and Hitmonlee to snipe those Magikarps, but I still think Gyarados is inherently the strongest deck in the game. I think that its position in the meta right now is just like the tiny smidge behind Mewtwo. And then yes, we have Celebi and Exeggutor making it into S tier this week. I do think that this will rise as sort of the third best deck in the format unless we see something crazy. And Charizard EX, which I have at the very top of A tier, sort of taking over and becoming much more popular, which could really drown out a lot of these Celebi decks, if we're being honest with you. But for right now, Celebi EX with Exeggutor, that's important, with Exeggutor is an S tier deck right now. It's on the kind of the borderline, but I would kind of at least put it in S tier. Next up is Charizard EX. If more people play Charizard, it is an S tier deck. It's one of those decks where if enough people play it, it's just going to win. It's just, we're going to see people get lucky, draw well, play well with Charizard. The more people that are playing this deck, the more likely it is to just stomp. At least 1 or 2 people in the tournament are just going to stomp everybody because the upside to Charizard is so high. Even though it lacks a little bit of consistency, it's by far the most inherently strong deck in the game. For that reason, it's going in the top of A tier. It also did well in this past tournament. Pikachu and Zebstrika, it's still sort of the best anti-meta pick right now to things like Gyarados. It's still a consistent deck. It struggles against Exeggutor, but again, it's pretty decent across the board for sure. And then we have the other Exeggutor deck with Mew EX. I think that this is totally fine. We don't have enough people playing it to kind of determine whether it should be in S tier or not, but I do think it's a really good deck. It probably belongs in A tier. And the next up are those aggro fighting type decks, which again are really good anti-meta picks. They're decently strong in the format, but again, similarly to Pikachu, they struggle with things like Celebi and Exeggutor, and they also can struggle against Mewtwo, which is probably the most popular deck in the format right now. Next up is Arcanine. It's Tempo Fire. It doesn't have as high of an upside as Charizard, but it is a little bit more consistent. Not enough people are playing Arcanine for it to really emerge as a top tier deck, but I think it has potential. I really do. It's going to fit in the middle of A tier. And then next up, we have sort of the other fringe Mew decks with being Aerodactyl and the Greninja versions that do have potential to win tournaments. They can really win any matchup. They just don't necessarily see enough play, and they're not necessarily as straightforward as the other decks above them. I do think that they're really strong. So the difference between like the top and bottom of A tier is really small. It really comes down to meta share and what it's done in the tournaments over the last week. So these decks are going to be at the bottom of A tier. And then into the B tier, these are kind of these fringe decks that really you shouldn't be playing above any of the things above them, but they are still good. They can still win games. You'll see all of these decks probably, winning or being at the top of tournaments here or there just because they aren't bad decks. There's just better options, I think. Things like Articuno, no matter how you're playing it with Starmie or Greninja. Pikachu and Raichu, also a strong deck, but again, probably not worth playing above anything else. Above it, Celebi version, that is by far the worst play to play Celebi. Make sure you're playing Exeggutor in your Celebi decks, but Celebi is Celebi. It can still win games. And then Blane's, of course, which I think has a decent position in the metagame right now. Unfortunately, it's still not strong enough against Exeggutor, so we're going to keep it here in the B tier. And then same with Pidgeot and the Mew EX aggro kind of mixed deck. It's another one of these sort of, you could honestly put this in the A tier right here, but I didn't know. I thought that there's probably better ways to play Mew EX, so I wanted to kind of just throw it in the B tier. I don't really have strong opinions about this deck either. And then same with Pidgeot again. Are we really going to see Pidgeot rise into the A tier? It's hard to say. It's hard for me to really put Pidgeot in the A tier. I just don't see it as an A tier deck. I love it. It's fun. It's really flexible. It's cool. There's a lot of different ways to play Pidgeot. I just don't necessarily think that it's an A tier deck. I could be wrong. Comment below. I would love to hear your opinions. And then in the C tier, these are decks that really have fallen out of favor. They just don't have good positions in the metagame right now. Again, things like Golem and Scolipede could pop off. They could win games. They could win tournaments. There's no reason not to. It's just as far as, you know, choosing a deck right now in the card metagame, it's hard for me to select something like a Scolipede and a Golem, given, you know, all of the other decks that people are playing in the format. So there it is, guys. There is probably what might be kind of the definitive Mythical Island tier list. We'll probably do one more tier list at the end of the format just to kind of wrap things up and summarize. But for right now, I think most things are kind of figured out. I think the format is settling in a really interesting way. Small things might change here or there, but for the most part, I think this is kind of what we're looking at for the Mythical Island format. I feel pretty good about it. Comment below, what are your opinions? You know, what did I get wrong in this tier list? What would you change? I didn't include every deck in the format in here. I know a lot of people commenting like, what about Alakazam? What about, you know, this and that, or, you know, whatever. Listen, I can't put every deck in the tier list. This video was already 45 minutes long. What do you want from me? If your deck, you know, has on average like 5 people playing it out of 2,000 people, I can't really spend the time to talk about it, so I apologize. But another long video, but I do enjoy these tier lists. I actually have a lot of fun doing it. So next week we will do another tier list, but it'll be probably something different. I might rank like the best cards from Mythical Island. I might just do like a best cards tier list, or maybe a best EX Pokemon tier list. Let me know, actually, what would you rather, you know, what would you like to see as from a tier list video from me next Tuesday? I would love to sort of hear your opinions, but comment below. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe. 45 minutes of me talking straight is crazy. I don't know. You guys watch it though, so listen, I appreciate it. Yeah, we'll see you tomorrow. We'll see you in the future. I'm rambling again. I don't know how to end videos, so yeah. Peace out. Later. See you next time. Like and subscribe.